Well, it's Wednesday, time for another awesome topic in meteorology, and this one's all about something I really enjoy, outflow boundaries when it comes to thunderstorms.
I bet it's something everyone watching this has experienced, but you might just not know the name for it. So we'll get into it. It occurs with a lot of thunderstorms, even just decent-sized thunderstorms, but of course you can have these with your larger supercell storms as well. So if you're looking off in the distance, you see a rain shaft coming down, that cooler air descending from the thunderstorm cloud with all the heavy rain associated with it. Once it impacts the ground, it has to spread out in all directions. And as it does so, it brings that cool air along with it in what we call our outflow wind gust and our outflow boundary. So you have your heavy rain or downdraft within the thunderstorm, the strong winds, and all the rain right underneath the storm. But then as it hits the ground and spreads out in all directions, we get that outflow, and that can cause new storms to form. We'll get into that in a second. But these outflow boundaries, also known as gust fronts, here's the schematic of a thunderstorm forming. We have enough buoyancy in the atmosphere, enough warm air to rise to form our thunderstorm cloud, cumulonimbus cloud. We get the rain to come down from the cloud in usually one concentrated area, and then as it hits the ground, it spreads out in all directions, and it'll eventually dissipate. But as that rain-cooled air is spreading out in all directions, we get a cool gust of wind, usually preceding the thunderstorm rain that we get. So we can kind of identify this as a mesoscale cold front or a really mini small scale feature on a weather map that comes usually ahead of a main line of thunderstorms that's moving through the area. So you have that cool downdraft, that cool air spreading out ahead of the storm, and then warm air rises up ahead of it. You can sometimes get clouds that form, shelf clouds or roll clouds along that gust front. But you can see it on radar too. This is a really extreme example in Louisiana with a bunch of outflow boundaries converging. All that lift in the atmosphere kind of came together and formed more thunderstorms. Another example closer to home from this past weekend in North Dakota, these really thin lines on radar, those are all outflow boundaries with these isolated thunderstorms. This was an example also from last weekend. This outflow boundary propagated all the way into south central North Dakota from storms farther west. And this example, you can see these thin green lines on radar. Those were the outflow boundaries from these two small cells. And this bigger example, this whole ring around this relatively stationary thunderstorm complex, that's an outflow boundary. So why can we see this really thin ring on radar denoting the outflow boundaries? Well, that cool push of air sometimes lifts insects, dust, or other aerosols along that leading edge, and that can be detected on radar. You can also create a pretty big dust storm along that outflow boundary, a really strong gust of wind ahead of the thunderstorm complex. An example from Sioux Falls last year, and it can be seen on satellite too. This is from a different part of the world where you have a lone thunderstorm coming up with the outflow boundary associated with that cool air spreading out ahead of it. But I mentioned that you can sometimes get these shelf clouds that form along that outflow boundary. So you have all of this cool air coming down from that thunderstorm, the rain, and the cool air spreading out ahead of it. And then the warm updraft has to be forced upwards, and that can condense into our shelf cloud along that leading edge of the thunderstorms. You can see that shelf cloud sometimes pass by you first, and then you get the rain from the actual thunderstorm complex. So here's a line of storms. You can denote it by that mini cold front symbol, as I mentioned. You can see it on velocity mode on radar as well. You can sometimes get pretty strong and damaging winds with these outflow boundaries in extreme cases ahead of the actual rain that comes. And in supercell thunderstorms, and we would sometimes have a tornado associated with it, you can get these downdrafts and then these outflow boundaries that just spread out in all directions from the actual thunderstorm itself. So they can be short-lived or they can last for longer than a day. So it can be a focusing mechanism for new thunderstorms even a day after the outflow boundary has formed. So that's why knowing the position of the outflow boundary can help meteorologists pinpoint the location of where new storms will form even the next day. These outflow boundaries can act as a trigger mechanisms, especially when they converge on each other. That provides more lift in the atmosphere for more storms to form. And the way we can try to identify these subtle outflow boundaries to predict where new thunderstorms will form is either on satellite, on radar, you can see these outflow boundaries, or using surface weather observations denoting really small-scale subtle wind shifts. And knowing where these outflow boundaries is, like I mentioned, really important to denote where new storms will form. Here's an example where you can see that outflow boundary on radar coming out from this complex of storms, providing enough lift in the atmosphere to provide more storms. And with an outflow boundary on a bowing segment of a line of storms that's really strong, sometimes delivering really damaging winds, that can sustain this thunderstorm complex as it moves farther out, in this example, towards the east. So these outflow boundaries, something we have to pay attention to. You can even see them on radar. We'll point them out to you on Sky Tracker radar sometimes, where you can see that subtle feature create new thunderstorms.
And we've seen that a lot lately in the environment that we've been in. A lot of those rings and stuff, those outflow boundaries, and again, producing new storms.
Exactly.
Jacob, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Jacob.
One of my favorite topics, thunderstorms, and there's a whole bunch of different kinds, right? Multi-cell storms and all that. Take it away, Jacob.
Yeah, so we are in thunderstorm season, severe weather season, actually, for many areas across the northern plains. Haven't had a whole lot of severe weather lately, but there are a different multitude of thunderstorm types that we can go over. Single cell thunderstorms we'll get into in next week's topic. Those are your garden variety pulse thunderstorms or even supercell thunderstorms that are most likely to produce tornadoes. This week, we'll be talking about multi-cell thunderstorms, those larger thunderstorm complexes, and what hazards those can possess. Yesterday, we actually had a pretty good example of multi-cell thunderstorms with this line of storms that formed in central North Dakota. And on initiation of these storms in north central South Dakota, you can see each one of these individual cells forming and then maintaining itself in a line as it progressed to the north, and eventually made its way into the Bismarck-Mandan area, produced some severe weather to the north and west of the metro area. But you can see each one of these individual cells growing, falling apart, sustaining a much larger complex, a multi-cell cluster of storms. So here's a schematic of what these multi-cell storms look like. You can have each one of these individual cells grow, dissipate, and form new cells back on the upwind side, and those clusters can grow even larger. So new updrafts form along the leading edge of rain-cooled air, or the gust front, which we called talked about a couple of weeks ago in Morse Code of Weather. So you have each one of these cells that form as they grow to a pretty large size and then dissipate. That downdraft, the rain-cooled air, hits the ground and spreads out in all directions with our gust front. That can lead to more initiation of new thunderstorm cells nearby, and that's what we deem the multi-cell cluster. And these individual cells usually last for 30 to 60 minutes, while the system as a whole can last for many hours. And these multi-cell storms can produce hail, strong winds, even brief tornadoes, and flash flooding if these storms go over the same areas for a prolonged period of time. So as we look at the schematic over a longer period of time, let's say for 20 minutes, you can see each one of these cells growing, forming new cells behind it as the first ones dissipate. Looking at a different view of these multi-cell clusters, the towering cumulus clouds form. We get our cumulonimbus clouds producing those strong thunderstorms and then dissipating as they lose that updraft. They become downdraft dominant. We get the rain-cooled air to descend to the ground. So each cell is carried downstream by the upper level winds. So wherever the winds in the upper levels of the atmosphere are moving, that's where these thunderstorm clusters will move, with new cells forming upwind of those previous cells to take their place. So as they move or propagate forward, we can get new cells that form behind it or nearby. And that's when we can get training thunderstorms. So the speed that the multi-cell cluster moves in makes a big difference in rain totals. And we can get cells that form in a line and go over the same location, and each one of those thunderstorms produce a lot of heavy rainfall that adds up and can lead to flash flooding, forming in a line. Think of like train tracks. So as these individual cells move downstream, additional cells form behind that and move directly over the path of those previous cells. You have saturated soils at that point. That can lead to flash flooding a lot quicker. You can also get back-building storms when new cells form so fast that each new cell develops farther upstream, so that we see that this multi-cell cluster is either just stationary or even moving backwards. When you have a lot of instability in the atmosphere, you can get these cells to almost remain stationary, form big thunderstorm clusters over one area, and really dump a whole lot of rain in a fast amount of time. So once we get a little bit more arranged with these multi-cell clusters, we can produce squall lines. Usually this happens along a linear forcing mechanism like a cold front, and that can produce really damaging straight line winds, but they do pass rather quickly. They can produce shelf clouds that you see on the leading edge of these squall lines. They can be hundreds of miles long, but typically only about 10 to 20 miles wide. And these squall lines are a little bit different when we look at this schematic. We can see that the updraft is tilted a little bit, and they continually reform along the leading edge with the rain and hail falling behind. So this allows that updraft to remain sustained as it pushes forward over a certain area. And with a specific type of squall line called a derecho, these are long-lived, very strong squall lines that can travel hundreds of miles across a large area. We can get them around here, but they're a little bit more common closer to the Midwest and the Great Lakes. Along these squall lines, we get bow echo segments, these backward C shapes, and this is where the damaging wind threat is greatest. That's where the storms are moving forward most quickly, and we can even get a little bit of rotation on the edges of these bow echo segments, leading to brief, quick spin-up tornadoes. And that's something we have to watch for when we're watching these squall lines come across an entire area. These multi-cell clusters can produce severe weather, so something to be aware of.
So true, yeah. And severe thunderstorm chances, minimal next couple of days, but we all know that, well, we all know, as I give you the forecast coming up, that we got a good chance for thunderstorms in the coming days.
Exactly.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob.
You're welcome.
Can it get any better? I've got my cupcake. It's Wednesday, and we got a Morse Code of
What's
Weather.
the face on it? Is it looking up at the clouds?
It's looking up at the clouds.
He's rolling his eyes.
It's rolling
How
eyes
clumsy you are.
at the forecast,
Yeah.
apparently.
Yeah.
Well, you know, last week we talked about multi-cell thunderstorms, and this week a little bit of a different take on single-cell thunderstorms. Jacob?
Yeah, so single-cell storms can be your garden variety, non-severe storms, but they can also lead to supercells that are discrete storms, single-cell storms that produce our most prolific severe weather. So these single-cell non-severe storms, Kevin mentioned this a couple minutes ago, pulse storms. In an environment where you have a decent amount of humidity and instability in the atmosphere with your daytime heating, you can get these small popcorn thunderstorms to develop across a region. So they're small, weak, short-lived, and form due to that daytime heating. The sun heats the ground heats the air, and we get enough convection or enough rising air to form these smaller thunderstorms with one updraft, one column of rising air, one downdraft, one column of sinking air with brief heavy rain or lightning. So a schematic here, they can last between 10 and 30 minutes or so before they fall apart, with some heavy rain and lightning in their most mature stage, and they can develop a gust front or outflow boundary as those rain-cooled air is descending, hitting the ground, and spreading out in all directions. So going step by step with these small pulse thunderstorms that are single cell, the cumulus cloud builds dominated by our updrafts. We have enough instability in the atmosphere in that one location. The cloud continues to grow into sometimes a cumulonimbus cloud. In that mature stage of development, we have both our updraft and our downdraft. With the downdraft, our sinking air, we can get a cold pool. We can get a little bit of that gust front with the rain and wind spreading out as it hits the ground. And then that storm will usually quickly dissipate as it becomes downdraft dominant. All of that air is sinking within the storm, and it falls apart. That cold air reaches the ground and spreads out in all directions, and our storm falls apart. On the other hand, supercell thunderstorms, again, discrete, usually single-cell storms, they're a lot more severe and cause our most prolific severe weather outbreaks. They're single rotating cells with a tilted updraft. Kind of looks like a corkscrew here, where you have rising winds within that big cumulonimbus cloud spinning around really quickly. They can last for several hours, producing tornadoes of very strong magnitudes, damaging winds, and large hail. On radar, these supercells usually have a bit of a hook echo appearance, with sometimes that tornado forming inside that hook echo. And again, these are discrete single-cell storms that can produce sometimes these large tornadoes within that hook on a radar image. And with multiple supercells that form in a certain area, sometimes the farther south one will be the strongest, as it has the most moisture available to it, usually coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, or moisture source. But there's a lot of complicated components to supercell thunderstorms that we'll get into in the next couple of minutes. It's all about, though, that rotating updraft within the center of the storm. and that is what allows it to sustain itself for several hours in some cases. It's highly organized with these updrafts and downdrafts that can contain up to 100-mile-per-hour plus winds, and that can lead to our severe weather and our damaging winds. And these are what usually produce our tornadoes. It's all because of shear, though, in the atmosphere. Shear needs to be present for these supercells to form. Shear is the changing of winds with direction or speed with height. So let's say we have a wind coming out of the south at 20 miles per hour, but aloft we have a wind coming in out of the east at 50 miles per hour. That is both directional and speed shear in the atmosphere, allowing for rotation to form and allowing for our updraft and our downdraft within these supercell thunderstorms to separate from each other. That allows the storm to not fall apart really quickly when we get the updraft to be separate from our downdraft. Another schematic here with some labels. We have our big cumulonimbus cloud. As it reaches a stable layer way up in the atmosphere, the cloud can't form anymore. We get an anvil. The cloud spreads out at that level of the atmosphere. We can sometimes get an overshooting top where the cloud tries to breach that stable layer of the atmosphere. But down near the ground is usually where all the action is, where we can get a wall cloud that descends. That's preceding a tornado usually, where we can have this lowered rotating cloud, and then a flanking line or some other cumulus clouds that form behind that main cumulonimbus cloud. These supercells can either be low precipitation, which is less common when there's not a whole lot of rain that falls along with our rotating cloud, or high precipitation, which is more common, and these can lead to rain-wrapped tornadoes, which are pretty dangerous because you can't see them. It's all about that rotating updraft inside the cloud, as I've mentioned. It's called the mesocyclone. That rotating updraft sustains our supercell thunderstorm, and it's that low pressure that sucks up all of our winds really high up into the cloud, creates for a more sustained environment for these supercells to track over longer distances. Within the storm, we have our updraft right near the center in the hook area of our storm on a radar appearance, but we also have those downdrafts. What has to rise in the atmosphere has to come down as well with that rain-cooled air. On the forward flank, or the frontward side of the storm, as you're envisioning this moving towards the north and east, that precipitation comes down and hits the ground and spreads out in all directions, but there's also a downdraft on the back side of the storm that can get wrapped around in that mesocyclone or in that rotating updraft. So some complicated components there as we're dissecting a supercell storm. And these can form tornadoes. When we get that updraft to be tilted in the atmosphere, we get a wall cloud to descend a little bit closer to the ground, and then that tornado to come down and make contact with the ground. It's all formed with all of this rotation in the atmosphere. We have to have that downdraft or our winds and rain coming down and hitting the ground to form that rotation and form that really small-scale tornado on the bottom of some of these supercell thunderstorms. But even if it doesn't produce a tornado, these can produce our largest hailstones and our most damaging winds. So supercell, those discrete storms, when it's not connected to a big line or a big mass of thunderstorms, can sometimes be our most dangerous ones to watch out for.
That's so true. Well, we mentioned it, right? Wednesday?
Yeah.
Day after a holiday. Jacob Morse. What more do we need? Right? Another weather lesson, which is perfect, right?
Yes.
So the past couple weeks we talked about single-cell thunderstorms, multi-cell thunderstorms.
Yeah.
This is an extreme example of squall lines or multi-cell thunderstorms that get really organized and can form straight-line wind damage in excess of 100 miles per hour sometimes. Sometimes this straight-line wind damage is worse than tornado damage. So this is a little bit of a personal story for me because my hometown of Connecticut was struck by what's called a macroburst, which we'll get into, in 2018, causing the damage that you see in all of these pictures. This was actually one of my friend's backyards with several dozen trees toppled over all in the same direction, and it was caused by straight line winds and a specific type of that called a macroburst, struck in 2018 with 110 mile per hour winds, causing this widespread damage. So these microbursts or macrobursts, depending on the size that the straight line winds range over, happen in thunderstorms. They can be sometimes single-cell, supercell thunderstorms when you have precipitation that gets suspended up in the cumulonimbus cloud. You get a lot of rain, you get a lot of hail suspended in that updraft with the rising air, and then as that column of sinking air descends in the downdraft, it impacts the ground and spreads out in all directions, and at that epicenter point is where the winds are the strongest. You can kind of see with this picture that mass of rain and hail coming down from the thunderstorm cloud and about to impact the ground. So the raindrops or hail is suspended in that updraft. It's what's called precipitation loading, and as that updraft weakens, the hail or rain, that mass plummets down to the ground. So the weight drags all of that air down with it once the updraft can't support it, and it impacts the ground and spreads out in all directions. Not all thunderstorms will produce microburst or macroburst. You have to have some specific atmospheric conditions, but these are all in a larger category called downbursts, and a schematic of that where it impacts the ground, spreads out in all directions with extreme wind both sides of the impact point, and then gradually gets less for the wind the farther you get out from that point of impact. But a pretty cool animation here of that mass of rain and hail coming down and impacting the ground, and with all those very strong straight line winds. So it can be referred to as the splashdown point, with kind of a star pattern coming out in all directions. And then the strongest winds can be on one side of that point of impact from where that massive rain and hail impacts the ground. And microburst is less than 2.5 miles in diameter in terms of the strongest winds. Macroburst more than 2.5 miles in diameter. But we had an example of these downdrafts, a microburst, because it was fairly small scale, in Sioux County a couple of weeks ago on June 21st with 125 mile-per-hour winds from that microburst. The National Weather Service went out and did a damage assessment and came up with a conclusion that the debris pattern was divergent in nature, but all of the objects were pushed towards one direction, towards the east-southeast, with one home destroyed southeast of Selfridge and one person injured. So the difference between tornado damage and straight line wind damage is all of the winds from the downdraft or the microburst push the objects towards one direction, versus tornado damage. It's a lot more, there's more circles and the objects are pointed in different directions. The damage is a lot more scattered instead of all objects pointed in one direction. That's because wind flows into a tornado, curving the curvature of the inflow winds into that tornado means that the debris will be laying in various different angles. Versus with straight line wind damage, the wind flows out from a downdraft or a microburst, and that means all the debris is parallel to that outward wind flow. So that was one example, microburst or macroburst causing extensive straight line wind damage. We also have what are called these MCSs, or mesoscale convective systems, that can cause extensive straight line wind damage. And this is a schematic of why these can sustain themselves. So we have that downdraft from a, let's say, linear line, a squall line of thunderstorms coming across an area. If the winds coming into the storm are strong enough, that will allow for the storm to sustain itself. The gust front, or the cold pool of air, meaning that once the rain impacts the ground and tries to spread out ahead of the storm, it'll kind of choke itself off if those winds coming into the storm aren't strong enough. So in these MCS examples that we're going to go over in the next couple of minutes, the storms can sustain themselves for prolonged periods of time. This is a very long technical title, but a type of MCS is a quasi-linear convective system. We like to come up with these different acronyms here, QLCSs, but it's a group of storms that are arranged in an apparent line that propagate over a certain area, and we can get a lot of straight line wind damage associated with these, with even some embedded areas of rotation, some quick spin-up tornadoes. But the most extreme example of these MCS systems is a derecho. That's when the wind damage swath is more than 400 miles long, when there's 58 mile-per-hour plus winds for the majority of that path length. This was an example from a couple weeks ago, June 29th in Illinois. The cornfield was flattened by the straight line wind damage from a derecho. The damage stretched from eastern Nebraska all the way down to portions of Indiana. And these derechos are widespread wind events resulting from persistent and violent outflow of those winds from these mesoscale convective systems. Here in North Dakota, we only get one derecho about every 4 years. They're a lot more common into the Mid-South and the Midwest towards the Great Lakes. But our most recent derecho was in 2018, when MCS formed in Montana, tracked across North Dakota, and provided widespread wind damage throughout much of the state. This was an example from a couple years ago in Iowa, one of the strongest derechos on record. And these are similar to those other type of straight line wind events, when the squall line can sustain itself with enough inflow coming into the thunderstorm, and you get that wind to come out in one direction, causing extensive damage to crops, property, and things that we don't want to see around here. Fortunately, we don't see the derechos that often, but we can see those microbursts and macrobursts like we saw in Sioux County a couple weeks ago.
No matter what you call it, it's never a good result.
Exactly.
Microburst, macroburst, tornado.
It's all bad, right?
Yeah.
All damaging. The 2018 event, the entire weather team was here covering it all night. It was crazy. I mean, let's hope we don't have that again. 5 years ago, late June of 2018. Thanks a lot, Jacob.
You're welcome.
Good stuff.